Chapter 12. As Barry later said, it wasn't as bad as it looked, but that made it quite bad enough. They'd slapped him around, bloodied his nose, and the business with the fox's head had put him into shock. He was more frightened than hurt. I laid him on his bed, covered him with a blanket, brought him water. He began to pull himself back together again pretty quickly, and then, I sensed, felt a little embarrassed. Unreasonable, but also understandable. He was a proud old man, as soon as I discovered, and couldn't have relished being seen by a stranger in such a state. In any case, once I was sure he didn't need a doctor, I left him alone and went back into the kitchen. There, looking through the arch, I gawked at the horror of the living room. The sight was nearly indescribable, the disgust it aroused almost beyond expression. Once upon a time it must have been a cozy room, and its odd, jumbled furniture, flea market items, gifts from friends, made that myself, gave it a rough, homey quality. But now it was like the inside of an abattoir. Blood glistened on the shiny brocade of that heavy old armchair. It was sprayed on the walls. A bookcase made a dam for a red, thickening stream. The remains of the fox were lumps of meat in this grisly stew. The head was the worst, raggedly hacked away at the neck, its face grimaced in agony, the enormous yellow eyes still bulging with the pain they had felt. They'd also cut open its belly, and the guts were spilled around the legs of the chair. It was hard not to gag, but this was, I knew, a horror I couldn't ask Barry to face. So I stepped as carefully as I could through the carnage and found a shovel outside on the porch. With this, I pushed the gore into a bloody puddle in the middle of the carpet, and picked it up like a sling and dumped it into the wheelbarrow. Obscenity. There was nothing you can do except bury it. Trying not to look at what was directly under my nose and cutting off each breath before it got to my windpipe, I grabbed up the handles and trundled the barrow around the side of the house. I was looking for a garbage can, an old carton, anything. But behind the house, stretching down one side of the yard, was a long strip of garden, and so I humped my way across ruts and over old cucumber hills to the end of it. There, with the fox's pitiful howling as a graveside lament, it had never ceased. I scooped out a hole and tipped everything in. Finally, having covered it all up, I flung the shovel into the night. At last I could breathe again. Wandering a little way from the garden, I let the night cool me and looked around in the darkness. There was no moon, but it must have been shining somewhere, for the sky had a soft pewter sheen. To my left, at the back of the house, was a muddy jumble of sawhorses, boards, a bale of old snow fence. Stretching in front of me and away to my right, a dozen old apple trees twisted their shadows against the glow of the sky. The kennels, cages, pens, whatever you called them, lay just beyond this. They were made entirely of wire and were lifted up off the ground on log pilings. Here was the source of that thick, musty odor I'd smelled, and the crying which, even now, still prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. Foxes, perhaps 24 of them. I watched them as they paced back and forth, dim gray shadows, flitting like bats. With the blood of their own kind so thick on the air, they moved with the panic that only exhaustion can still. But all at once, I suppose a breeze brought them my scent. They fell silent, and the emptiness of the night, like a crystal globe, dropped around me. I didn't move, and then I held my breath almost in awe as a dozen golden eyes glowed in the dark. For an instant they froze me in my tracks, then one voice began crying, a second joined in, and soon they were all howling again. I went back to the house. Despite my efforts, the living room remained, most literally, a bloody mess, so I tore a couple of flaps off a cardboard carton and tried to scrape up as much of the gore as I could. Then I spread a lot of newspapers around. After that, short of a mop and pail, there wasn't much more I could do. It was now after 10. While I'd been working, I'd heard the shower running, but now it was off and I tiptoed into the kitchen, assuming that Barry was trying to sleep. After a moment, though, I thought I heard him moving around in the back of the house, and I called out to him. A pause, long enough to be awkward, stretched out before he called back, "I'll be there in a minute." I looked around the kitchen. It was old and shabby, reminding me a little of Granger's clinic. The lino was loose and wavy, the old cupboards bore innumerable coats of chipped white paint, and there was an ancient stove with big heavy knobs. I poked around in the cupboards, looking for coffee, but finding tins of Campbell's soup, Chef Boyardee, cordon bleu Irish stew, and a great deal of tea. Red rose in bags, 4 small tins of Twining's Irish breakfast, Earl Grey, Russian caravan, Darjeeling. Given this indication of his taste, I filled a kettle and put it on the old stove, then set cups and saucers on the table at the far end of the room. Here, pinned up in the corner, was the kitchen's sole decorative touch, a 1941 calendar issued by the Hudson's Bay Company, which showed a brawny, ill-painted Indian carrying a canoe up a portage. While the kettle boiled, I sat down beneath it and tried to put together a picture of the man who lived in this place. He was lonely, I guessed, a solitary, a bachelor. Certainly no woman had any claims to this kitchen, and there was a combination of clues, the homemade aspect to the house and its furnishings, the very location of the place, and the foxes themselves, that made me think of one of those self-educated, self-sufficient working men who take night courses, harbor pet obsessions and projects, but who are practical enough to bring them into cranky, quirky reality. As a guess, this turned out pretty well. When he stepped into the room a moment later, it was clear that Barry was a very definite character. A wiry old fellow with gray hair, worn in a bristly brush cut, and a trace of white stubble over hollow, leathery cheeks. He'd changed into a rough gray sweater and a pair of old wool trousers, but his feet were bare, and this made him seem all the more vigorous. Inevitably, covered in vomit and blood, he looked rather pitiful, but now that feeling was entirely dispelled. An old sailor, you might have thought, or a tough old jockey, except he was a bit bigger than that. He hesitated a second, as if embarrassed, then managed a brief, flickering smile. "I should thank you, I guess." "That's okay, Mr. Barry." "Nick," he said. "Nick Barry." "Robert Thorne." He nodded, tried out his smile again. "Guess it was just lucky you came passing by." I poured out the tea, lifting the pot and trying to look cheerful. "I thought you could use some—" He nodded, crossing the room. I realized I was sitting in his regular place and began to get up, but he waved me down and pulled out a chair. He took a sip of his tea, a fussy, noisy old man sip, and as he did so, I was able to put my finger on something I'd missed before. Except for some mugs, all the china I'd found in the cupboard was of the same pattern, a heavy glazed pottery in an earthy yellow color. The cups were broad and very shallow, the saucers almost flat. They were rather elegant in comparison to the rest of the place, and now I recognized them. They were Russell Wright ware, a style that had been popular in the 40s. My parents had had some, the last few pieces ending their days at the cottage. As he set his cup down, I said, "Are you sure you're all right, Mr. Barry?" "I'm all right." "I've got a car, if you want. I could take you to a doctor." "No," he shook his head. "Like I say, I'm all right." The defensiveness in his voice was just this side of hostile. I tried to stay neutral. "That was quite an ordeal you went through. I guess what you really need is a good rest." "I'm fine. I thank you again for all you did, but I'm fine now. Really, I am." I smiled. "And I guess you'd like me to get out." His mouth drew back in a deep, frowning crease up his cheeks. "Sorry it sounded like that. Like I say, I ought to be grateful, and I truly am. But I'm okay now. It's late, and if you want to stay, you're welcome, but don't do it on my account. Those men got what they came for. They won't be back." "Got what?" I wondered, but I asked, "Do you know who they were?" He shook his head. "Never saw them before in my life." "You mean they just came in?" "Yes." "What did they want?" "I have no idea. But you said—" "Listen, Mr. Thorne, what happened tonight, that would be hard to explain, and I'm not sure there's much of a point, but it wasn't as bad as it looked." I hesitated. A moment passed. The foxes were still barking out in the yard, and Barry's eyes moved to the window. His chair creaked as he shifted his weight. It was obvious that he had no wish to talk about what had happened to him, despite the gratitude he felt for his rescue, and certainly if he'd wanted to wait till morning, I wouldn't have blamed him. Indeed, I would have preferred it. But I also knew it was important for him to understand that he was going to have to talk, so as easily as I could, I said, "I'm a friend of Harry's. Mr. Barry, I think I said that." He nodded. "I guess you did." "Do you know he's dead?" They said he was." Yes, he died a couple of weeks ago in Detroit. The police think it's a suicide, and maybe it was, but those men drove him to it. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Barry. He squinted at me. How come you know all this? I shrugged. I wasn't just passing by. I've been following those men for days. As you say, the reasons why would be hard to explain, and I'm not sure there's much point. I'm a friend. I'm on your side. That's what you have to remember. Harry had lots of friends, but some things even his best friends didn't know. Listen, Mr. Barry, no matter what you say, no matter what anyone says, nothing can hurt Harry now. But other people can be hurt. You can be hurt. I don't give a care. His voice was suddenly vehement. Tonight, that's what I thought. Why should I? After all these years? They deserve all they get. He smiled, then a quick, rueful grimace. That's how come I'm alive, Mr. Thorne. No luck at all. No thanks to you. I just told those men what they wanted to know. Who cares anymore? Unsure what he meant, I said nothing, but I watched his face. For a second, exhaustion flickered a deep inner emptiness into which his features collapsed. Then he leaned forward, gulping his tea. Though, when my own hand touched my cup, it felt cold. For a second, his eyes went out to the window. Poor Harry, he murmured. He called me a month or so back. He'd do that, every once in a while ask after the foxes. That was the excuse. He bought them for me, you see, when I quit working. 6 breeding pair, all registered. Harry liked to say it was a joint venture, just a hobby now, but eventually the market was bound to come back. He always believed that. He loved foxes. They are cunning, he'd say. He loved the mutations, like I've got, but he especially loved the natural reds, the most beautiful fur, warm, durable, skin's pretty easy to work. He was always saying we'd go in together in a big way. His money, what I knew. Harry always liked to have plans. That's what I noticed this last time he called. No plans. It was almost as if he was saying goodbye. He shrugged. I guess maybe he was. I took a moment, crushing my cigarette out in the saucer. He was talking now. Should I encourage him to continue or put it off till the morning? The trouble was, by the morning his defensiveness would probably harden to obstinacy, and Nick Barry, I suspected, could be a very obstinate old man. Making up my mind, I leaned forward a little and said, Those men, Mr. Barry, can you tell me about them? They were Russians. How do you know? They spoke it. They talked to each other. So you speak Russian? Sure. My real name's Berzin. My father was born in Kiev. But you're a Canadian? He nodded. I was born in Montreal. Barry is French. My father, though, was Russian to the day he died. He always spoke it at home. That's how come I met Harry, because I could speak it. When was this, Mr. Barry? He shrugged. 28, 29, I'm not sure. Around the time Brightman first traveled to Russia? You know about that? Yes. I didn't think it was much of a secret. No secret at all. Anyway, that's how it happened. I went with him. He wanted someone who spoke the language, but also knew furs. I was a grader by then, but no one knew skins like Harry, but I knew enough. So you were his translator? Sure, but I only went twice. After that, he'd picked up enough so he could go by himself. He coughed. The Russians were really excited about furs back then, Canadian furs especially. Just a year or so before, Jack Coswell sold them 65 pair of silvers, and that was the basis for their whole industry. He nodded, half to himself. We got a real nice reception, the best hotels, our own droshky to cart us around. Other people went to Russia and got the black bread blues, but it was the caviar that did us in. This is when you met Zinoviev? So you know that too, he shrugged. You're right, though. Kirov, then Zinoviev. The very first 2 the Bolshevik shot. Yes. Then on an impulse I added, Didn't you meet a woman as well? Anna Kostina? Bolshevik shot her too, he shrugged. Poor Harry. He never had good luck with his ladies. I remembered Granger's words. The best lies always contain some of the truth. Some people say he got her pregnant. That's crazy, though I suppose maybe not. You never know about women. She was interesting, though, a real red. They say the women were even tougher than the men. Anna, the old lady, Broshkevsky. Anna knew everyone. Lenin, Trotsky, Kamenev, and the Bolshevik killed them all. Every last one of them. What about Dimitrov, Mr. Barry? Wasn't that someone else Anna introduced Brightman to? He frowned. Been a long time since I heard that name. But you know it, don't you? He shook his head. Not then I didn't. When did you learn about him? Same time as everyone else. when the Reichstag burned down the big trial. I remember I once asked Harry if he knew anything about him, and he told me he'd met him back then. Great man, Harry said. Maybe he was. The Bolshevik never got him. You must have been proud to meet him. His eyes went shifty. Did I? I guess you do know a lot, maybe more than I know myself. I wouldn't say that, Mr. Barry, but I think you did meet him. This would have been a little later, probably the spring of 1940. Dimitrov made a secret trip to Canada that year, for the Comintern. I'm not exactly sure why, but he probably wanted to tell North American communists to forget about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He wanted them to ignore it. Stalin and Hitler were in bed together, but the workers were to back the war effort to the hilt. He came to Halifax to tell them that. Maybe the Canadian and U.S. governments even helped him to get there, and I think that's when you met him. So what if I did? But isn't that the point of all this, Mr. Barry? Dimitrov's political mission had a private side as well, and that's where Harry Brightman came in. Dimitrov was frightened. Kirov, Zinoviev, Kamyenev, Radek, Tukhachevsky, Pietikov, Belakun, Lenski, Worsky, Kapuk, Eberlin. Stalin had already amassed a huge list of victims, and Dimitrov was afraid he would be next. So he was trying to save what he could. He knew there was no hope for himself, even if he'd refused to go back, and they would have got him eventually. But he thought he could save the life of one little girl. Maybe the child was his, maybe not. That doesn't make any difference. In any event, with Brightman's help, he smuggled the child out of Russia, and then Brightman adopted the child as his own. It was all done very slickly, but not slickly enough. 40 years later, someone got on to him. I watched Barry's face. It concentrated in a frown of genuine puzzlement. Then he shook his head slowly. You've got it wrong. You still don't understand. I shrugged. Don't I? But I was sure I did. You tell me then, Mr. Barry. He was silent. A moment passed. His eyes held mine for a second, then shifted to the dark window. The foxes were still whining, crying, and barking just as before. He listened, and I could see the pain which their pain brought into his face. Maybe I was pressing too hard. I thought maybe I should hold off till tomorrow. I tried to keep my voice gentle. If you like, I began, but he was already shaking his head. Slowly, he pushed himself up from the table. No, he said. That's all right. You don't understand. You don't understand nothing at all. But I'll tell you. Just give me a minute to settle them down. A side door led out of the kitchen, and beside it, on an old newspaper, was a pair of muddy rubber boots, their tops turned down in a cuff, just like the boots I'd worn as a child. He put these on and opened the door. I made no move to stop him, and when the latch clicked shut, I stood up myself. Looking out, I peered through my reflection into the night. You don't understand, he'd said. Had I got it all wrong? I didn't think so, but I knew, of course, that the all still eluded me. I stepped outside. There was a cast cement porch, tilted at a rather uncertain angle. From here the night seemed vast, stretching away, while high in the sky the clouds were like enormous shadows cast before some infinite silvery light. Across the lawn I could see the glistening tracks of Barry's boots had made in the dew. I followed them across the wet grass, through the orchard, where the sharp, sour smell of fallen apples undercut the musk of foxes, and then onto a stretch of packed dirt. Beyond this, the cages lifted out of the gloom. I waited, standing a little way. Inside their cages, the foxes twisted and floated like puffs of mist, and as Barry moved past each pen, the fox inside would leap up and bark with excitement. I caught up to him as he reached the last of the cages. The wire was torn. As he pushed the mesh together, the edges sprang back with a twang. He murmured, "She was the mother of most of these. That's partly why they're so frightened." "I'm sorry," I said, and then, remembering with guilt my long delay on the road, I added, "You understand, Mr. Barry, I thought you were one of them, with them. That's why I didn't come sooner." He nodded, and then I saw his fingers tighten in the mesh of the torn cage. I looked away, toward the foxes. I could see why he loved them. They were beautiful, exquisitely so, their wild golden eyes shining forth from dark, delicate faces. They moved like cats, with a slinky, elegant grace, and though I wouldn't have said they were tame, they looked friendly, pushing their muzzles up to the mesh for a sniff. They varied in color. Some, like the dead fox, were pure white. Others, almost black, were overlaid with a sparkling silver sheen. Beside me, Barry cleared his throat. They were bastards, you know. Real sons of bees. You can kill a fox so it doesn't feel anything, grab them by their hind legs, and turn them over. They'll just lie there, and then step down lightly over their hearts. They don't feel a thing, just go to sleep. I think they even knew that. At least they knew how to handle her. But instead they— He leaned back on the cage. A moment passed. Sons of bees, he murmured again. Then, as the animals began barking at the far end of the row, he shrugged himself off the mesh and began moving again. I fell into step. Let me tell you again, Mr. Barry, I have nothing to do with those men. I understand. I'm a friend of Harry's. I'm a friend of his daughter's, May Brightman. She has nothing to do with this. I told you. You've got it all wrong. There was a child. You know there was a child. Maybe. I'm just saying it doesn't make any difference. Stopping in front of a cage, he drew his hand up into the sleeve of his sweater, then pushed the loose end of wool through the mesh. The little fox inside was black as midnight. He ran over and tugged at the wool and started to suck. I waited. Up this close, the smell was very strong, though it was hard to be offended by anything produced by such beautiful creatures. They seemed calmer now, crying less, and even these cries were more like a bark, but most were still pacing up and down in their pens, and I could hear the quick scratch of the paws on the boards. After a moment, Barry pulled the sleeve back, then moved along to the next cage, and did the same trick again. The fox chewed, licked, grunted softly all the time, and then, with his face pressed up to the mesh, as if addressing someone at the far end of the cage, Barry started to speak. Later, I sometimes wondered why he'd chosen that moment. Maybe he was more comfortable out with the foxes, or maybe it was just because the choice was his. In any case, the words came out of him easily. I almost had the impression he wasn't speaking to me, but was setting the record straight for himself. To understand, he began, you've got to know something about Russia. Russia back then. 1930, let's say 1940. In those days, the Bolshevik had all sorts of problems, but his biggest was the one everyone's got. He was broke, but for him that had a special twist, because even the money he did have was worthless. All the rubles in the world didn't add up to $1. Actually, it was even worse, because when he did get a little together, he still couldn't go near a bank, on account of how Lenin, when he took over, had refused to pay off the old Tsarist bonds. Banks all over the world were holding them, and every time the Bolshevik tried to open up an account or sell something, they'd like as not send the sheriff around. So all in all, the Bolshevik was in a real fix, and he tried everything he knew of to get out of it. He confiscated every bank safe in the country to get foreign currency. He tried to sell the crown jewels. Near worthless, he found, and in 1923 he took all the gold and silver out of the churches. Now gold, of course, that was the one thing they did have. For egalitarian, proletarian, red revolutionary communists, you might say they took a keen interest in this stuff. In fact, first thing after the Great Revolution, the first things first, you might say, they got the mines open again. But even that didn't do them much good. The Americans stopped them in 1920. Along with the Brits and the French, they passed a law making it illegal to bring Russian gold into their countries. You can see what that meant. No one would give the Bolshevik credit. He had no money, and what money he had wasn't worth anything, and people wouldn't even go for his gold. Just to get the most ordinary things, he had to pull all sorts of tricks. You follow me this far? I did. And I knew that everything he'd been saying was true, but I said, I follow you, Mr. Barry. I'm just not too clear where you're going. That's okay. I'm almost there. But in fact, he now paused, pulling the wet, ragged sleeve of his sweater back from the cage and moving along to the next one. The fox inside it ran over as it started to suck. Barry went on, just remember what I'm saying. It was almost impossible for the Bolshevik to get regular things, locomotives, machine tools, even food. Now think. What about those other things so dear to the Bolsheviks' heart? Certain scientific supplies, for instance, or military items. And what about the Red Revolution? They believed in it then, you remember, the world revolution that would make the Bolsheviks safe. These days, of course, when they don't care, it's no problem. They want to support the French CP, and they just slap some money into a bank account. They went to finance their friends over in Africa. They use the Swiss banks. Their gold's good enough now. So's their natural gas. Even the ruble's worth something. What are you trying to tell me? That Brightman smuggled gold out of Russia in the furs he was buying? Think a minute. The furs were the gold, and year after year Harry went over to Leningrad and brought it back. I don't understand. Those trips were no secret. That was the beauty of it. Everything was out in the open. And everyone knew he was doing it, Mr. Barry. There was no law against selling Russian furs. Well, time to time, place to place, that hasn't exactly been true, but it isn't the point. Mr. Barry, I'm asking, what is the point? It's so simple. No one ever did see it. Year after year, Harry brought those furs back, and year after year he sold them, bale after bale. But the Russians never sent him a bill. That was his secret. They gave those furs to him, and though they made Harry rich, he had to use the money just like they told him. Barry chuckled then, an old man's laugh deep in his throat. You ever hear that expression, Mr. Thorne, Moscow gold? Well, this was the real thing. That's what it was all about. You see, the Bolsheviks' gold, poor Harry's money bags. Overhead, the moon finally pressed a disk of silver light through a patch of clouds, and beside me one of the foxes shoved its snout against the mesh. They are cunning, he'd say. He especially loved the natural reds. Harry Brightman, a red fox with golden eyes. I'll be darned, he whispered.